The Gay Agenda, an agenda for change. Happy? After the Ball, guiding manifesto for a new brand of pragmatic gay activism. An agenda for change. What we have discovered is in fact an agenda of heterosexual thoughts and actions that we must somehow change. In this episode, we move from reviewing the physical health risks to the mental health risks faced by the LGBT community. According to the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, depression and anxiety appear to affect gay men at a higher rate than the general population, high risk of suicide. Lesbians may experience chronic stress. This stress can cause depression. Depression and anxiety appear to affect bisexuals at a higher rate than the general population. It is very easy for transgender persons to become sad and depressed. According to the Waging Peace Agenda for Change among Straights, instead of gays are suicidally unhappy, activists want society to believe that gays would be as happy as anyone else if we would just treat them fairly. Specifically, we want straights to believe that when treated with respect and friendship, we are as happy and psychologically well-adjusted as they are. Should LGBT persons be treated with respect and friendship? Yes, of course. Would LGBT persons be happier if treated well? Yes, of course. But would LGBT persons be just as happy as anyone else if treated well? Ever thought of how LGBT activists would get society to believe this claim? Strategy from After the Ball. Portray gays as victims of circumstance and oppression. In any campaign to win over the public, gays must be portrayed as victims in need of protection so that straights will be inclined by reflex to adopt the role of protector. Our campaign should not demand explicit support for homosexual practices, but should instead take anti-discrimination as its theme. Portray LGBT as victims. Anti-discrimination. How have these strategies influenced LGBT activism in Singapore? Dear straight people, according to a survey of gay, bi and queer men in Singapore aged 18 to 25, 54% have contemplated suicide. 56% have been called derogatory names. 29% were pushed around or beaten up because of their sexual orientation. Hacking Unicorn. Suicide, depression, oppression. Do we have blood on our hands? Nearly half of trans women have contemplated suicide. The Singapore Psychological Society. LGBTQ people face a higher risk of having mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicide, and self-harm than heterosexuals. Stress from discriminatory experiences are a recurring theme among those seeking mental health support, prejudice, and intolerance. In July 2021, LGBT Health published Experience Homophobia and Suicide Among Young Gay, Bisexual, Transgender and Queer Men in Singapore. This study explores the association and mediation pathways between experienced homophobia and suicidal ideation or suicide attempts among young LGBTQ men in Singapore. Ever thought of why LGBT mental health issues or suicide are often, if not always, associated with homophobia or discrimination? Are there other contributors to mental stress or suicide? Do you recall? Conversion. We mean conversion of the average American's emotions, mind and will through a planned psychological attack. Propaganda relies more upon emotional manipulation than upon logic, since its goal is to bring about a change in the public's feelings. Conversion makes use of associative conditioning. In conversion, the bigot is repeatedly exposed to literal picture or label pairs. The effect of presenting a bigot with an extreme instance of a stereotypic picture or label pair is to augment the strength of the bigotry. Encountering an extreme instance of the stereotype reinforces the pattern of stereotypic thinking.
What this means for kids who are being bullied, who are different, who are lonely, is they can't sit down and watch the same TV with their parents on media call and see images of themselves as whole, as healthy, and as accepted.
What are your views on the use of picture or label pairs to reinforce a pattern of stereotypic thinking? Is it true that societal discrimination is the reason for LGBT unhappiness? Dr. Neil Whitehead, author of My Genes Made Me Do It, Homosexuality and the Scientific Evidence. Very little evidence has been found for this. Whether in tolerant or accepting environments or in intolerant ones, the incidence and type of psychological problems remain about the same. A senior consultant psychiatrist in Singapore, Chan Lai Gwen, wrote, "An oversimplistic attribution of suicide or self-harm to a single cause of the experience of being discriminated or rejected for identifying as LGBTQ leads to the myth and misunderstanding that if all discrimination and rejection were to be removed from the community, there would be no more suicides." Let's look at the best countries in the world for LGBT people. According to a Gallup poll in 2015, Netherlands, the first country to legalize same-sex marriage in 2001, was voted the #1 country for gays and lesbians to live in. Although legal and social equality for gay people is further advanced in the Netherlands, a large representative study of Dutch adults found that gay men were 3 times more likely than heterosexual men to report a mood disorder or anxiety disorder, and 10 times more likely to report suicidal thoughts. The Dutch findings are especially striking, given the country's good record on equality for gay people. In 2020, Sweden was named the most LGBTQ-friendly country, thanks to the country's progressive laws and attitudes towards the Sweden LGBTQ+ community and travellers. Do you recall this cohort study in Sweden? The overall mortality for sex reassigned persons was 2.8 times higher during follow-up than controls of the same birth sex, particularly death from suicide 19.1 times.
There was a 19 times higher hazard of suicide, of completed suicide. This is in the context of Sweden, which was by far the most welcoming, accepting society of transsexualism, even through the 70s.
How about this Swedish study? Treatment for anxiety disorders was higher in persons diagnosed with gender incongruence and who had received gender-affirming surgery, relative to persons diagnosed with gender incongruence and who had not received gender-affirming surgery. In another Swedish study, suicide in married couples in Sweden, the risk for suicide was higher among same-sex married individuals compared to different-sex married individuals. Even in a country with a comparatively tolerant climate regarding homosexuality, such as Sweden, same-sex married individuals evidence a higher risk for suicide than other married individuals. Why are LGBT persons still more unhappy and suicidal than heterosexuals, even in the world's most LGBT-friendly countries? The experiences of local LGBT persons may shed some light. The reality and struggle of being an average-looking gay man. According to LGBT counsellor Clinton Power, many gay men find it hard to make friends and suffer from deep loneliness and isolation. There is enormous discrimination and judgment within the gay community. I've spent my whole adult life trying to make friends with other gays only to feel alone and outcast. An open letter to gay men seeking quality connections. My first coming out would be what most would call a success, incredibly supportive family. My second coming out to the gay community was surprisingly stressful, frustrating, and exhausting. I had no genuine relationships on the dance floor or flicking through Grindr. Gay men cause significant stress for other gay men due to in-group discrimination, often more harmful than being rejected by members of the hetero majority. Confession. I wish the gay scene was more accepting and inclusive. I feel unwanted by the gay scene in Singapore. It makes me feel like I shouldn't exist. I'm lonely and maybe I'll just die sad and lonely. An open letter to all lonely gay men jaded with the scene. All my straight friends seem to be settling into a life of marriage, kids, and all-around wholesomeness. My gay social circle, however, seem to be stuck in a never-ending high school that revolves around appearance, parties, and Instagram. Gossip is rife and scandals are aplenty. This study concludes that openly gay men are more prone to suffering from anxiety and depression compared to those in the closet. If there's one takeaway we can conclude from the data, is that the gay scene doesn't do any favors to its inhabitants.
It's hard to trust anyone in the community. All this backstabbing, all this gossiping, all this slandering. What are we, high school?
Gay loneliness is a silent epidemic facing the queer community. What are some underlying reasons behind gay loneliness in the queer community? Why is such a prevalent issue a silent epidemic? We turn your attention from gay loneliness to another silent epidemic in the LGBT community: domestic violence. A review of same-sex intimate partner violence. Over 50% of gay men and almost 75% of lesbian women reported that they were victims of psychological intimate partner violence.
The really staggering statistics are the 43% of lesbian women and over 60% of bisexual women who are in a relationship with a woman have suffered from domestic abuse. That is genuinely just catastrophic, isn't it?
I didn't really realize how serious it was or how common it was until I started really meeting a lot of lesbians and hearing their stories. It's just so common that either every person I've dated, every friend I've had, every acquaintance I talk to, every comment I have on this channel, like, they relate. And it's like, why?
I thought this new relationship was a dream come true, but it turned out to be a living nightmare. We had a big fight, and when I got home, the house was as though it was being hit by a tornado. And it was obvious that she was trying to tear my passport apart. And that was when I decided to leave her. I knew if I did not take the step to leave, I would have been dead.
Nobody talks about transmasculine people and intimate partner violence. We don't have conversations about it within the LGBTQ+ community, so why don't we talk about it? Though the amount of research regarding trans people is limited, it is estimated that anywhere from 30 to 51% of trans people experience intimate partner violence. When we try to access help for these problems, we often run into barriers.
Domestic violence is a silent epidemic in the LGBT community. Have efforts by LGBT activists to project LGBT unions as similar to healthy heterosexual unions ended up silencing or preventing a large segment of the LGBT community from finding much needed help? Why is domestic violence so prevalent in the LGBT community? Why would LGBT people harm one another? Gays or LGBT persons would be just as happy as anyone else if we would just treat them fairly. Is this true? What are your views on these silent epidemics within the LGBT community? Why do you think LGBT people suffer higher rates of mental health issues? The Journal of Human Sexuality, Volume 1. There is a general consensus in scientific literature that greater pathology exists among homosexually oriented people than among heterosexuals. No empirical study has ever documented that these higher rates of pathology may be explained solely or even primarily by society's disapproval of homosexuality. The New Atlantis Sexuality and Gender Special Report. Poor mental health outcomes may be mitigated to some extent by reducing social stresses, such as discrimination, but this strategy is unlikely to eliminate all of the disparities in mental health status between sexual minorities and the wider population. Other factors, such as elevated rates of sexual abuse, may also account for some of these mental health disparities, as research has consistently shown that survivors of childhood sexual abuse are significantly at risk of a wide range of medical, psychological, behavioral, and sexual disorders. A 2013 study comparing adverse childhood experiences revealed sexual minority persons had higher rates of adverse childhood experiences compared to their heterosexual peers. These included household mental illness and substance abuse, incarcerated household member, parental separation or divorce, exposure to domestic violence, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The American Journal of Public Health. The higher rates of abuse experienced by sexual minority youths may be one of the driving mechanisms underlying higher rates of mental health problems, substance use, risky sexual behavior, and HIV reported by sexual minority adults. An analysis of the Queensland-Australia Suicide Register. We tend to assume that psychological distress LGBTI people are often going through is due to family rejection, but it seems that's not so much the case. The conflict seems to be largely related to relationship problems with partners. In the next episode, we will dive deeper into the dynamics of LGBT relationships. In this episode, we have reviewed the use of associative conditioning through picture or label pairs that reinforces the pattern of stereotypic thinking by linking LGBT mental health issues and suicides to societal discrimination. How has this strategy impacted society's views on LGBT mental health issues? Does this strategy help or harm the LGBT community? Follow us on